The space race was a competition between the United States and Soviet Russia to get to space first and eventually the moon between the time period 1957 to 1975. They were able to do this due to winning World War II and emerging as the new superpowers. They then engaged in a non-confrontational war for politics. The United States fought for capitalism, and the Soviet Union fought for communism. It was during this Cold War that the passive-aggressive space race was born. The idea came from the Germans in World War II. They had developed a liquid-fueled ballistic missile, the A-4, that could fly into space. After Germany lost the war, the United States launched Operation Paperclip to recruit as many German rocket scientists as possible, while the Soviets launched Operation Osavakim to recruit their German rocket scientists. The United States' main scientist was a recruit named Wernher von Braun, and the Soviet Union's main scientist was named Sergei Korolev.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched the first man-made satellite. Sputnik could send a radio frequency that could indicate its location. It was launched from an R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile. It showed the reach of the Soviets' missiles and worried U.S. citizens that the Soviet Union could send a nuclear warhead into U.S. airspace. Some citizens also feared that the satellite could spy on them. Sputnik was not built for anything this advanced, however, and more importantly, the satellite never crossed over United States airspace. Eisenhower was alarmed by the success of the Soviet satellite and ordered Project Vanguard to be moved ahead of schedule. But the American satellite exploded on launch, becoming a rich source of comedy. In the United Nations, a Soviet representative offered a Soviet program of technical assistance to backwards nations. Explorer 1 was successfully launched January 31st, 1958. While later than Sputnik, Explorer 1 could measure cosmic rays, radiation, and temperature. Explorer 1 lasted 4 months because of its battery life. During these early days, however, not every Explorer project went as well as Explorer 1's project had. Explorer 2 through 9 all had something go wrong, with the exception of Explorer 3, from exploding on launch to things breaking in space. The group launching most of the Explorers was called NASA and was formed July 29th, 1958, right after the Explorer 4 launch. The USSR won this race by launching the first satellite. In return, the United States rushed to launch their first rocket, becoming a laughingstock for the world after their rocket exploded. The United States did match the Soviets eventually, but it certainly lost the race to launch a satellite successfully. Not only were they slower, but the US satellites failed way more often than the Soviets did.
The leading motivation for the USSR to put a man in space was the American plan to accomplish this task in 1961. The Soviets started off strong, sending a dog named Laika into orbit in 1957. She lasted only a few hours before the extreme heat and stress killed her. Later, on March 9, 1961, a prototype of the Vostok 1 was launched into space containing a life-sized human dummy and another dog, Vezokta. This prep work led the Soviet Yuri Gagarin to be sent into space in the actual Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961. He stayed in space for 1.8 hours and orbited the Earth once. As the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, the governing body for aerospace records, had determined that the pilot had to land with the spacecraft in order for a mission to be counted as an official space flight. The Soviets claimed that Gagarin had stayed in the pod until after landing. But later in 2002, Russian officials admitted that when coming back into Earth's atmosphere over Australia, Gagarin had ejected and parachuted down to Earth. Although not technically counting as an official spaceflight, Yuri Gagarin is still considered the first man in space, and was, at the time, regarded as a hero, traveling the USSR as a national treasure. On May 7th, 1961, just 3 weeks after Yuri Gagarin entered space, the space capsule Freedom 7, carrying Alan Shepard, launched into suborbital flight. He later walked on the moon in the Apollo 14 mission. Alan Shepard's first spaceflight could have been accomplished 3 weeks before Yuri Gagarin's, but NASA had inserted one more test flight, not knowing that the USSR would send a man into space 3 weeks later. This U.S. program to put a man in space and return him to Earth was known as Project Mercury. This project was originally started by the U.S. Air Force, but was taken over by NASA in its early existence. Project Mercury conducted 20 unmanned developmental flights, some with animals, and 6 flights with astronauts who were known as the Mercury 7. All of the rocket ships ended with the number 7 to honor the 7 astronauts chosen for this mission. In the long run, the USSR space accomplishments brought increased public support for the NASA space program to get a man on the moon.
Interestingly, Kennedy posed a collaboration between the two superpowers in September of 1963. However, Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd of the same year. Initially, the USSR planned on joining the United States. They believed that the two countries could finally complete the quest to put a man on the moon. But the USSR did not trust the new president, LBJ, so the operation failed to occur. The Luna program was a series of robotic spacecraft missions sent to the moon by the Soviet Union between 1959 and 1976. 15 were successful, each designed as either an orbiter or a lander, and accomplished many firsts in space exploration, such as orbiting the sun and moon, taking pictures of the far side of the moon, and landing and returning from the moon. They also performed many experiments, studying the moon's chemical composition, gravity, temperature, and radiation. 24 spacecrafts were formally given the name Luna, although many more were actually launched. Those that failed to reach orbit were not publicly acknowledged at the time and not assigned a Luna number, an example of the selective publicity of the USSR.
Project Apollo's goals included landing Americans on the moon, returning them safely to Earth, establishing the technology to meet other national interests in space, and achieving preeminence in space for the United States. In 1967, Apollo 1 was the first attempt to get humans into space for the U.S., but the command module used erupted into flames during a test on the launch pad. The Apollo 2 through 6 missions in the year following were used to test heat shields, restartable engines, atmospheric reentries, and fix other mechanical problems. In 1968, the Apollo 7 through 9 missions were testing spatial orbit, while the next Apollo missions from 1969 to 1972 were focused on landing on the moon. Louis Armstrong was the first man on the moon on July 20th, 1969, in the Apollo 11 mission. Although news of this first moon landing wasn't rapidly spread throughout the USSR, the overall global reaction was one of excitement of humanity having accomplished such a task. Later, some more humorous achievements were accomplished on the moon. In 1971, the first sport was played on the moon. Alan Shepard, at age 75, decided to hit a golf ball, quote, miles and miles, on the surface of the moon. In the same year, David Scott delivered a metal figure of a man called the Fallen Astronaut to the moon, placing it near the landing site to commemorate the astronauts and cosmonauts, or Russian astronauts, who had died in the advancement of space exploration. The United States won this part of the space race. The space race had been covered heavily by media. The American astronauts were the pinnacle of American success. Soviets were portrayed as an evil force, spending massive amounts of their resources on a futile attempt to beat the Americans.
The space race was a nonviolent competition between two countries to prove that their ways were superior. Additionally, the Olympics were heavily covered by the media, like the space race. The public of both countries knew the significance of the competition. Man, for the first time, would make his way to the cold depths of space and eventually set foot on the moon. The 1936 Olympic Games mirrored the space race. While the United States and the Soviet Union were displaying their economic and scientific abilities in order to support their economic policies, the 1936 Olympics became a racially charged battleground. In 1931, Germany was selected to hold the Summer Olympics of 1936. However, after Hitler came into power in 1933, there was hesitation to have the Olympics in a fascist country. Reluctantly, most countries agreed that politics should be set aside for the Olympics. Many countries were not comfortable with the reports of anti-Semitism being directed towards Jewish athletes in Nazi Germany. Jewish athletes were barred from joining the German teams, excluding many important athletes, including Lili Henach, an athlete who held 4 world records in track and field events and was an eventual victim of the Holocaust. Many countries debated boycotting the 1936 Olympic Games, including the United States. The United States traditionally brought a large team, comprised of Jews that would be subjected to discrimination in Germany. Despite the wishes of the Jewish community, the United States Olympic Committee did not boycott the Olympics. Aside from indifference of anti-Semitism, the boycott was opposed by the African American community. Newspapers that advocated for participation believed that black athletes who won events in Nazi Germany would prove their beliefs in white supremacy false. Jesse Owens was one of the most successful athletes at the 1936 Olympics, winning 4 medals in sprints. Sometimes it is said that Owens crushed Hitler's narrative of Aryan supremacy. It is well known that Hitler himself never shook Owens' hand after his amazing performance. Ironically, at home, he was not invited to shake the president's hand either. While on a much smaller scale than the space race, Jesse Owens marks an important but peaceful international competition similar to the nonviolent competition of the space race, where a faulty ideology was proven to have important flaws.